Okay. Anyways, I want to welcome back Ari Zivotofsky. We haven't seen him since basically Tisha B'Av, but this is we can schmooze a little bit more than we could on Tisha B'Av. Always a pleasure to have him, a professor of neuroscience at Bar-Ilan University, halakhic explorer. I think that's the term you like to use. Really, is of course the author and the Jewish action of, I don't remember exact Mythbusters. Is it really true? And really an all-around interesting focuses on very interesting developments in history, halakha, hashkafa. So it's a pleasure to welcome him to discuss the sort of origins and evolutions of a kosher shofar. We want to thank our sponsor of today's class, Judy Landau, who's here. Thank you very much. Sponsoring in memory of her late brother, David Gordon, Aaron David Ben Harav Matityahu Herzl. Give me 1 second. Herzl Udvar Peruma. We should all be blessed with good health, long life, and the scoot of the learning should help all of us for a wonderful year. And thank you very much. Okay, Ravari, we can get started.
You hear me?
That's Thursday. Ooh, so somebody. Okay, I'm going to send another login. I apologize. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, go, Ari.
You hear me and you see the PowerPoint?
Yes. I just want to tell you something, Reb Ari. I just want to tell you something. That Benny Gesundheit discussed the machloket as to whether the shofar should be pashut or kafuf, just in case you're going to be mentioning that. Benny covered that.
We will mention it. It'll come up, but it'll be a small part. And you could maybe fill me in on if he discussed what those words actually mean in terms of the shofar. We'll get to that somewhere in the middle today, hopefully.
Thank you.
When was this? This wasn't today, was it?
It was yesterday. Two days ago.
Okay, we're saying this. So we're going to get started. And I'd like to talk really, when he talked about it, he was in the context of tefillah, I assume, and how we should daven on Rosh Hashanah. Today we're going to do
the context of how the Yerushalmi doesn't follow the Mishnah.
Okay. We're going to do very little philosophy, very little deep meaning, and much more practical and little biology, a little technology. And the question is, what do you make a shofar out of? What may it be made out of? How do you have a halachic shofar? And it's a question, if we think for a minute, it's really the only mitzvah deraisa we have on Rosh Hashanah is to blow a shofar. And yet, if you look in the Torah, nowhere does it tell us what a shofar is, what should the shofar be made out of. It doesn't even use the word shofar in the context of Rosh Hashanah. It tells us Yom Trua, Yom Zichron Trua, but nothing about shofar. The word shofar doesn't appear. No hint how to make it. And what's interesting is shofar has nowadays taken on a lot of meaning. It's not only the instrument that we use in Rosh Hashanah. I was at a wedding actually 2 nights ago, very traditional, I would say very, very traditional, following along, the playbook. And then suddenly, in the middle of the chuppah, which is at night, it was after dark, the father of the chosin took out a shofar and started blowing. Tekiah, shvar, trua, tekiah. I have no idea why. But shofars have taken on additional meaning. Many people, you know what? Let me just hold on. Reshare a second. So I can put this. Many people, when we think of shofar nowadays, a historical association of shofar with things like the liberation of the kotel. But what do you make a shofar out of? I mean, we know what it looks like. We have associations with different things. So one of the things that I want to say, we can't look in the Torah. There's nothing. There's nothing in Nach about what to make it. So I think the next place to look is Jewish artwork. If you look how Jews have depicted shofars over the years, that might tell us something about what to make a shofar out of. And so I would like to do a quick survey of some really old Jewish art. And one of the best places to find those old Jewish art is mosaics from shuls from, let's say, the 3rd to the 7th century. And if anybody tries to tell you that the Jewish population in Israel, after the destruction, all the Jews went into diaspora, there were no Jews left in Israel, and then we've come back illegitimately in the late 19th century, you just take a look at the number of shuls scattered throughout the country, mostly in the north, in the Galilee and the Golan, but in other places as well. And I'd like to look at the mosaics of some of these shuls. So, for example, here's the synagogue from Tveria from the 4th century. And as you can see, there's clearly a depiction of a shofar. Now, it could be they didn't hire the best artist available. It could be the guy had big tiles, so you can't make a high resolution. But nonetheless, you get a sense of what a shofar must have looked like in 4th century Tveria. And I don't know what shofars they use in your shul, but there are a few aspects of this shofar that do not remind me of the shofars that you usually see in shuls today. And hopefully we'll get back to that. So you got to look at this shofar, 4th century Tveria. Here we have from the Beit Knesset Shalom Al Yisrael that is in Yericho. Those of you old enough to remember, before there was peace in the Middle East, Yericho was easily accessible. We used to go there. Today, if you want to see the shul, you need to do it with coordination with the Israeli army and the Palestinian army. And there are groups that go in every few weeks to daven in this shul, but it is not a trivial matter. If you take a look at the mosaic, here also, there's clearly a shofar. And again, this one looks a little more like, I think, the shofars that we're used to, but it's not exactly like the shofars that we're accustomed to seeing. Here is from Beit Shan, and you can see again on 2 sides, see the shofars. Just keep these in your mind as we talk about some of the shofars later on. But again, I don't think these shofars really look exactly like the shofars that we're used to seeing in our shuls. Okay, so let's jump ahead now. Here we have from the Jewish encyclopedia, not the Judaica that many people are familiar with, the big, the green blue set, but this is the black books that were printed in 1903, the Jewish encyclopedia. Today it's available online. And you'll note that for each one of these shofars, there is a little number, and there is in the encyclopedia, a little reference. It tells you where they all come from. They're useless. So I've cut it out because it tells you from the collection of, Jack Cohn. I have no idea where he lived, when he lived. So most of them are pretty useless. Number one, they tell us, is from the community in India from the 19th century. So take a look at that, a little bit interesting. I think it's worthwhile noting that these shofars clearly are from multiple types of animals. Animal that was used to make shofar number 1, clearly not the animal that was used to make number 3, and number 4 is probably different. You'll notice that some of them are, like number 4 is curved in different ways, the 3 and 8, which are much straighter than all the others. And so it's a variety of animals and a variety of shapes. And whoever mentioned earlier, and if you take a look, probably number 12 is also clearly a different animal than I think the rest of them. Whoever mentioned earlier about kafuf, about bent and pashut, straight, you'll notice that there are clearly some of these that are kafuf and others that are most definitely straight. And just a little bit more from the art world, here we have from Amsterdam, 1728. You see the Baltokeia there on the bima blowing the shofar. And if we zoom in, you get a sense of what that shofar looks like. That, I think, looks much more like what we're used to seeing, a traditional shofar that we're used to. Okay, if from the Tanakh, we don't have much information about a shofar. For the artwork, we have a little bit information, but they actually look a little bit different than the shofars that we're used to. The next place to go, if we want to know from what to make a shofar, would be the Mishnah. Now, sorry, one more from Amsterdam. Again, this one doesn't look like a typical shofar. Okay, let's go to the Mishnah. By the way, if there are any questions, if you want to interrupt, it's not such a big crowd. And if I'm not clear about something, please feel free to ask in the middle. Okay, let's go to the Mishnah. Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, the first 2 prakim of tractate Rosh Hashanah. There are only 4 prakim, 4 chapters. The first 2 chapters have nothing to do with Rosh Hashanah. It has to do with how you look at the moon, declare the new moon, etc. When you get to chapter 3, the first Mishnah continues that theme. Finally, we get to the second Mishnah in chapter 3, and it tells us something about Rosh Hashanah. It tells us, Kol ha-shofarot ksherin, any type of shofar that you make, doesn't matter what kind of animal you use, it's kosher, chutz mishel para, except for a cow. Cow horn is not kosher for shofar. I hope this is going to work on Zoom. Here is a cow horn. This is actually the first shofar that I ever made. When I was an undergrad 40 years ago, I was in a small university. Across the road, there was a much larger university with a larger Jewish community, and they had a shofar making workshop. And this is what we made. We made cow shofars. I guess the guy who was in charge had never learned this Mishnah. And it blows, more or less. Anyhow, we'll see in a minute why this is what they chose to make. So the Mishnah says all shofars are kosher, except for those from a cow horn. And it gives a very strange reason. Mibnei shehu keren, because it's a keren. A keren means a horn. What's the problem? Well, let's see. Rabbi Yossi seems to argue. He says, V'halok kol shofar nikru keren. All shofars are also called keren. So Rabbi Yossi seems to argue, Rabbi Yossi seems to think that even a cow horn should be acceptable. So we have this Mishnah, and you're going to have to keep in mind, pretty straightforward, not complicated, but there are going to be three Mishnahs we're going to have to talk about. So this Mishnah says, all shofars are kosher, except for a cow horn, and that's because it's a keren. Seems to be linguistics, technical. Those who don't know what a cow horn looks like in situ, here we have some bull horns. Okay. Now, the Gemara actually wasn't satisfied with this. Here is my summary of the Gemara in Hebrew. I'll just go over it really quickly in English. The Gemara says, first of all, we have to respond to Rabbi Yossi. If you remember, Rabbi Yossi said, all shofars are called keren. The Gemara says, yes, all shofars are called shofar and keren. Bull's horn is only called a keren. But it seems the Gemara wasn't satisfied with this linguistic explanation. And Ula says, you know what? There's another problem. He says, if we use a bull's horn for a shofar, it may remind either God or us about the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. And you don't want to remind God about that on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, we're coming to plead for forgiveness and to then take a shofar and you look at it and say, that reminds me of not one of the happier stories in Jewish history. So that's what Ula says. Now, Abaye says, there's another reason. Abaye says, purely biology, if you look at a bull's horn, it has layer upon layer. It grows, it thickens by having new layers that grow each year. And Abaye says that those layers make it look like you have a shofar within a shofar within a shofar. And the Torah says you have to blow a shofar, one shofar, and not two or three shofarot. And if the horn is made of layer upon layer, it looks like you're blowing multiple shofars. And therefore, Abaye says you have to have any shofar except for a cow horn, because the cow horn appears to be multiple shofarot. Okay, which brings up an interesting question of taxonomy. The Mishnah just said everything is kosher except for a cow or bull. Well, what about something like a water buffalo? Is a water buffalo a bull, or is it some other kind of animal? Now, if you ask a biologist today, they'll tell you, no, they're different species and different genus. On the other hand, it looks pretty much like a bull. And if you took a kid outside and you showed him a bull and a water buffalo, and you asked him if these are the same, he would probably say, it certainly reminds me of each other. And if the issue is, let's say, reminding about the Egel Azov, well, maybe this reminds you about an Egel Azov. Or if the issue has to do with layer upon layer, here's a horn from a water buffalo that I got up in the Chula Valley, and you can't really see great on the Zoom, but it really is layered. You can see it nicely over here. You can see the layers. So depending on what the issue is, it may be that water buffalo will also be a problem, maybe not. Well, let's see what it means actually. Hold on. Let's go back. Till now, I said to you that the reason it's no good is because of something linguistic. But it's interesting, if you pay close attention here, Jay, you're going to like this. It doesn't say the Torah is no good because it's called a keren. It doesn't say nikra keren, like the Chachamim say nikru keren. He said, b'nei shehu keren. It is, in its mahut, in its identity, it's a keren. Somebody, a student, I don't know, Yeshiva Tarajon, came up with a beautiful idea. He said that a keren, by definition, is something that causes damage. It's used to gore. And if you take a look at the horns on a bull, they're in position to gore. The horns, let's say, on a ram, can't be used to gore, to to hurt somebody. And he even brings this Gemara, the Mishnah from Gemara from Baba Kama, Ein negicha el b'keren. Goring is done with a keren. So he said the problem with a bull's horn is that it is a keren, not that it's called a keren. Anyway, I think this was a nice idea. This is from a young student in Harachiona. Okay, so far we've had one Mishnah. The Mishnah said everything is kosher except the bull. We skip ahead to the next Mishnah. It tells us Shofar Shel Rosh Hashanah Shel Yael Pashut. So what should you use for a shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Totally different. It tells us that you should use the horn of a Yael, whatever that is, we'll get to it in a minute, and it should be Pashut, seemingly not curved. Well, first of all, what's a Yael? We just want to make sure we know. So when you're not sure, you go to Rashi. And Rashi tells us Yael, Steinbuch. I forgot for a moment that Rashi was not writing in English. I assumed all good Torah has to be in English. So I went to my book of mammals, and indeed there's an animal called a Steinbuch in English. But obviously this is not what the Mishnah is talking about. Rashi was writing in ancient French, which in this case happens to be similar to the German word Steinbuch. And this is what a Steinbuch is. This is what a Steinbuch is in modern German. It's there you go. Well, a clear wild goat or an ibex. And here is hold on, we have to back out a little bit, a horn from an ibex. And the Mishnah tells us that what should you use for the horn for the shofar Rosh Hashanah? A Yael. So first of all, I don't know how many of you in your shul, this is what you use. I think it's rare. Second of all, the Mishnah says, Pashut. So this look Pashut, this is not straight. So I don't know if Dr. Gesundheit explained what it means Pashut. We're going to have to explain it somehow because the Mishnah clearly thinks a Yael is Pashut. So we've now had two Mishnahs. One said you could use any shofar except the bull. The second Mishnah, this Mishnah says you should ideally use an ibex. That's Pashut. Now we're going to skip ahead. Hold on. We'll skip. I have a beautiful video here, but we're limited in time of what the ibex use their horns for. It's really, this is in Ein Gedi. When you come visit, you go down to the Dead Sea, and you can see these guys running. And we'll just watch 1 second to see. It's a magnificent thing.
Who is going to rule in
and just a spoiler, no ibex were injured in the production of this video. Even though you'll see that they take their battles quite seriously. Okay, he's eyeing the other guy.
First, a cautious assessment. This, impressive though it seems, is still merely a measurement of each other's strength. If one
Still
is
just evaluating if it's worth fighting.
Time for discretion to be the better part of valor.
And then we get
if
started.
both decide they have a chance of winning, then battle begins.
Wow. Okay, so as long as you don't have a headache, they probably have a headache. Okay, and now to the third Mishnah. We have one more Mishnah that tells us Shaveh HaYovel Rosh Hashanah L'Tkiyah L'Brachot. Yovel is the once every 50 years. The land goes back to its ancestral owner. All slaves are freed, and it has all the laws of Shemitah. Once every 50 years, it begins on Yom Kippur of the 50th year, and the shofar has to be blown. And what this Mishnah says is the Yom Kippur of Yovel and the Rosh Hashanah are similar in terms of how you blow the shofar and the brachot that we say in Shmoneh Esrei. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, they're not the same. He says Rosh Hashanah talking b'shel scharim u'b'yovel b'shel ya'elim. So Rabbi Yehuda says, what should you blow with? You should blow with scharim, which means a ram's horn. And on Yovel, the once every 50 years, that's when you use this. That's when you use the ibex. So we've now had three Mishnahs. There's a ram's horn for those who don't know. So we've had three Mishnahs. Everything is kosher except the bull. you should use an ibex, you should use a ram, and I summarized for you the debate about the bull's horn, and that's it. Those are all the Gemaras about what you should make a shofar from, except for one last Gemara way back in the first parak. And that Gemara tells you, Amar Rabbi Abahu, Lo metokin b'shel ayil. Why do we blow a ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Tiku lefanai b'shofar shel ayil. Blow in front of me with a ram's horn, Kadesh eskor lechem akedat Yitzchak. So I'll remember the Akedah, meaning we don't want to use the bull's horn because we said it reminds about the sin of the golden calf. Rather, the Gemara says, use a ram's horn. It reminds us of the sacrifice that Abraham was willing to make on the command of God. And that's it. Those are all the Gemaras. We've now seen it all. One more, we have to go back to see a shul, Beit Alpha, another old shul up in the Galilee. It's the smallest national park in the country. And it's great. Again, I don't know who the artist was. Looks like a kid's artwork. You can see Avraham, Yitzchak. Here's the ram caught in the bushes. And what the Gemara says is use the ram's horn to remind us of this story of the Akedah. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we've seen what seems to be a problem. 3 different Mishnahs, 3 different rules. So we're going to jump ahead about 1,000 years and see how the Shulchan Aruch rules. The Shulchan Aruch, very straightforward. Shofar Shalosh Hashanah, mitzvato. By the way, after we finish here, if you want to be able to find the source, when the Shulchan Aruch was written, he had, I guess, some sort of divine assistance here. This siman, if you want to remember it, okay, how do you know in which section of the Shulchan Aruch to find the laws of shofar? Laws of shofar are found in the section Shofar. They spell shofar. Shin and Reish is the same as Taf and Kuf, and then Pei Vav, meaning this siman is siman shofar. And the Shulchan Aruch says shofar shalosh Hashanah mitzvah b'shal ayil v'kafuf. So he tells you very clearly the ideal way to do the mitzvah is using a ram's horn that's bent. Now, how does a ram's horn look? We saw 1 minute ago. Here's how a ram's horn grows. Here's an example of a ram's horn shofar. This is, I'm sure you've all seen, a bent ram's horn. The Shulchan Aruch realizes not everybody necessarily has access to a ram's horn. So the Shulchan Aruch continues. He tells you, Up diavad, all ha-shofarot, ksherim, all the shofars are kosher. We're going to skip for a minute what he said in the middle. He says, V'shel para asul, meaning the Shulchan Aruch seems to hold that we did not have a debate between those 3 Mishnahs. Rather, the Mishnah that told you that a ram's horn is preferred is the ideal, and the Mishnah that told you that everything is kosher except for a bull is telling you, b'diavad, in the non-ideal situation, you could still use other horns. Now, I skipped the middle here. It tells you, b'diavad, kol shavar kshurim, ben pshutim, ben kfufim, whether they're straight or whether they're bent. But even within that, there is a hierarchy. Mitzvah b'kfufim yoter mipshutim. It's better to use a bent one, a curved one, rather than a straight one. Now, what is he referring to? What might be a non-ram bent horn and what might be a non-ram straight horn? Here we have an example of an animal that gives you a horn that's clearly not from a ram and not straight. This is a shofar like this. We got to back out, I guess. Okay, this is a kudu horn. Many of you have probably seen it when you go into Judaic stores. These are often sold as, somebody tell me if you've been in the Judaic store, what would they call it? The Yemenite shofar. This is often sold as a Yemenite shofar. This is a non-ram curved shofar. And according to the Shulchan Aruch, it's kosher. You're allowed to use it, but it's not preferred. He said the ideal is a ram's horn. You don't have a ram's horn, anything is good except for a cow. A curved one is even better than a non-curved, and this is clearly a curved, the kudu. Okay, and just so we have perspective, we'll see in a minute. I said it's called a Yemenite shofar. Where do they come from? Well, this is the warehouse where they all come from. This is in Namibia. Namibia used to be called Southwest Africa. It's just to the north and west of South Africa. And there they have lots of kudus. And you can see in this warehouse, lots and lots of kudu horns that eventually make their way to Israel, where they're made into shofars. Now, what's really, really important is that before a rabbi rules about a question, he's got to make sure he knows the reality, the facts. And here we have an article in some Haredi journal about the din of the really big, long shofars. It starts off by telling us, from where and what kind of animal do these long, long shofars come from? Marli Hasocher, the merchant, told me, Africa. That's true, they come from Africa. Mi behema ma'od gedula, from a really, really big animal. Ke'erech chatzi cheder, half the size of a room. V'azam martilo, and then I said to him, they're definitely from a non-kosher animal, and therefore it must be problematic to use it as a shofar. And then he goes on, and this is a 5-page article explaining why this shofar from the kudu is not good for the mitzvah. And of course, it's all based on a false premise. It's based on the premise that it's from this massive animal that can't be kosher. And the kudu actually is a kosher animal. There's no question this is a kosher animal. And the shofar would be kosher, not ideally. Ideally a ram's horn, but certainly if you don't have a ram's horn.
So we certainly want to blow your own horn is what we want to tell us. Want to blow your own horn.
You could toot your own horn with this. And then the Shulchan Aruch continued that this curved one, non-ram curved, is better, he says, than a non-ram not curved. And what could he be talking about that? Well, he might be talking about this kind of shofar. Okay, this, as you could see, is totally straight, not curved. And it comes also from the southern part of Africa, from an animal that we call today the gemsbok. In modern Hebrew, and I stress in modern Hebrew, it's called the ra'im. And it's certainly a kosher animal, the ra'im. Any doubts? Here is a ra'im that was trapped. This is the last few moments of his life. This is what happened to him after we got hold of him. So this is a ra'im that we shechted. I could tell you unquestionably, split hoof, chewed cud. It's a kosher animal. Its horn, according to the Shulchan Aruch, is kosher for the mitzvah, but not ideal. It's not a ram's horn, and it's not curved. Which brings us to what somebody mentioned at the very beginning. You mentioned that Dr. Gesundheit talked about kafuf and pashut. Maybe we should try to now define what it means curved and what it means straight. Because we've seen you could have really straight horns, like the gemsbach. We've seen you could have quite curved, like the kudu, or like a typical ram's horn. But yet we saw that the Mishnah calls the Yael also pashut. So I think the simplest explanation is that certainly the gemsbach is pashut, is straight. But I think also when the Mishnah refers to the Yael as pashut, it's because it's bent in 2 dimensions. The typical ram's horn is bent in 3 dimensions. It's not flat. It's curved, and it's also curved in this direction. It has a spiral. And I think when the Shulchan Aruch or the Gemara talks about kafuf as opposed to pashut, pashut means anything that's flat, that's in 2 dimension, even if it's even if it's curved like the ibex. And kafuf means something that has a spiral as well, that has 3 dimensions. Okay, so again, here's the gemsbach. It's very important to point out. In modern Hebrew, it's called the ra'im. It's likely that in biblical Hebrew, the ra'im was a different animal. Professor Felix has a long article on it where Professor Felix explains that probably the ra'im was the now extinct Bos Primogenesis. And that's very important because there's a lot of discussion about the ra'im is kosher or not for a shofar. Okay, I mentioned at the very beginning the question about the bull's horn and how you define it, and if the bison horn would be kosher. This wasn't simply a question that I made up. It's actually asked by Rav Yaakov Emden. Rav Yaakov Emden in Sheli Zayvitz asks if the karnei habuffalo, for buffalo horn, is kosher for mitzvah. And he goes through all of those things that we discussed earlier. whether it reminds the person of the sin of the golden calf, whether it might be called Karen, etc. Okay. So we mentioned that this is often called today a Yemenite shofar. What's interesting is Rav Yosef Kapach, who was considered essentially the chief rabbi of the Yemenites throughout the second half of the 20th century in Israel, in his commentary to the Rambam, wrote quite harshly against those who make shofars. He wrote, the artisans hashotim, the stupid artisans, in order to make the work easier for them, what do? They heat up the shofar, then they can easily straighten it out, and they straighten out the end of it, and that way it's easier to drill the hole through the shofar. We'll talk in a minute how we make a shofar, but what Rav Kapach said is by heating it, straightening it, and then drilling it, you're making it much easier to make the shofar, but you're making it not kosher. What Rav Kapach says is that is defined as a chatzor and not as a shofar. And if you look at the three pictures, you'll see the picture on the top, the drawing on the top is a ram's horn in its natural state. One in the middle is a ram's horn after being straightened. You could see that here. This is a typical ram's horn shofar. You could see that it's been straightened. It clearly did not grow like this. Rather, what Rav Kapach wants people to use is a ram's horn like this, which I don't know if you could see in the Zoom. It has not been straightened at all. It's much harder to make the shofar this way. They're much more expensive. But this is what's called in many of the stores a Yemenite shofar today. Okay. So we have seen, the Shulchan Aruch says, what is the ideal source for a shofar? A ram's horn. Diavad, meaning only if you don't have a ram's horn, he says everything is kosher, whether straight or curved. Ideally, if you don't have a ram's horn, you should use something that's curved. If you even don't have that, you could use something that's straight. However, he then concludes, Shel para pasul b'chol gavna, the bull's horn is pasul no matter what. And now, in a very strange thing, the Shulchan Aruch adds another sentence. Remember, I have shown you all of the Mishnahs about shofar, and I have shown you all of the Gemaras about shofar. And now the Shulchan Aruch adds something that we've heard no mention of until now. The Shulchan Aruch says, "V'chein karnei rov hachayot shem etzem echad ve'en lehem b'fnim zachus psulim." He says that the horns of most non-domesticated animals that are one bone and don't have an insert are pasul. Now, what's a shame is he was writing in Hebrew, because in Hebrew it's complicated to explain this. In English, there's actually two different words. And if he had those two different words, it would have been much simpler. What the Shulchan Aruch is saying is that horns are kosher, antlers are not kosher. When he says, Karnei rov hachayot, the things that grow on most wild animals that are one bone, he is referring to antlers as opposed to horns. Now, how do I know that? Well, he described it. Here is a typical antler. Okay, I don't know if you could see it. This is a, well, actually quite a large antler. And the way antlers grow, if we look here, antlers grow starting in the spring. On a young animal, they get small antlers. They have one solid bone. There's no insert, there's nothing on top. It's a solid bone with velvet that grows around it, with blood vessels in the velvet that provide the nutrients as it grows. The velvet eventually falls off in the heat of the summer. The antlers fall off in the fall, and in the winter, the deer or the animal has no antlers at all. Next spring, it grows back even larger, the next spring even larger, and each year there are larger and larger antlers that fall off that fall. That's what he means by etzem echad. It's one bone. That's as opposed to what he explained over here, that don't have inside the insert. And here, if we take a look at a typical goat horn, for example, here's a goat horn, and I don't know if you could see, inside there's the white. The white is the bone that's attached to the skull. Surrounding that, you have a keratin cover. And that's what the shofar is made of. It's really that cover, that that thing that the bone goes inside of. And what the Shulchan Aruch is saying is what's kosher for a shofar is something like a goat horn. Or here was the ram horn, you see the hollow over here, had that bone inside that was removed. How is a shofar made? Well, first of all, you have to wait for the animal to die. Because unlike an antler, or shechted, unlike an antler, a horn stays on the animal for its entire life. The bony insert is in there, and it has this keratin coating, and it just grows together as the animal gets older. And either you have to shech the animal or wait for the animal to die. You then cut it off the head of the animal. You have this bony insert, which has to be removed. Once you remove the bony insert, it's now hollow most of the way until about here. You then cut off a piece, you drill the mouthpiece, and that's what we've done over here. You can see this wasn't straightened at all. This is a goat horn. And we just, I don't know if you can see it here, we drilled the mouthpiece over here. And now we can understand what Rav Kapach was talking about. Rav Kapach, when he talked about the lazy artisans, so if you want to make this over here, you have to remove the bony insert. It's hollow all the way till about here, but as it keeps curving, it's very difficult to drill. So usually what they do is they straighten out the ends, and once you straighten it, you could drill straight through. To make this hole is much more difficult. And so that explains also why the very first time I made a shofar, we used the bullhorn, because a bullhorn is even easier than a goat horn. There's nothing to straighten. You just cut off the tip and you drill through and make the hole. But here too, you could see there was a bony insert. The Shulchan Aruch says over here, you should ideally use a ram. You could use anything else. Curved is better than straight. You can't use a bull. And then he says, antlers are not kosher for a shofar. And the question is, where did he get this from? Nowhere in the Mishnah, nowhere in the Gemara. Why does he suddenly tell us antlers are no good for a shofar? Now, the Shulchan Aruch didn't usually make things up. He must have had some source for it. And what's interesting, his source was the Ramban, Nachmanides. And where does the Ramban discuss this? In his famous drosha for Rosh Hashanah. Now, there are those who complain that their rabbi speaks too long. Some rabbis will go 10 minutes, some will go 20, some will go half hour. Well, the Ramban must have gone for hours and hours. He has a famous drosha that he gave the year that he made Aliyah. He came to Akko and he gave this drosha. And it talks about every aspect of Rosh Hashanah, from tshuva to the very basics of the biology of making a shofar. And the Ramban, who was by that point an old man, explained that in his youth in Spain, he had come up with this idea on his own. He said, why are antlers not kosher for the mitzvah of shofar? He said, because the mitzvah is to use a shofar. And the word shofar is from the root shoferet. Shoferet means a tube, a hollow tube. And therefore, he said, only these things that have inserts, a shofar. And you could then have a kosher shofar if it's a ram, or you could have a puzzle shofar if it's a bull. But he said, the antler, it's not that it's a puzzle shofar, it's not a shofar. So therefore, when the Mishnah talked about which shofar is kosher and which shofar is not kosher, it doesn't mention antlers, because antlers aren't even a shofar. So it's not that it's puzzle as a shofar, it's not a shofar. But the Shulchan Aruch, I guess, felt that he needed to make that point. He quotes the Ramban and says that antlers are not kosher. The Ramah then adds a line over here that also has no source in the Gemara. He says, here all of the antlers, Ramah adds, V'chein shofar mi behemet tmeah pasul, a shofar from a non-kosher animal is pasul. And that's a very strange statement, because all of the animals we've talked about till now are all kosher. The kudu and the ibex and the ram. And a matter of fact, there's a Mishnah in Nida that seems to imply that the existence of horns on an animal is a sign that it's a kosher animal. So I'm not sure to what the Rama is talking about. What animal has horns is not kosher animal, and his shofar would be not kosher. The example that most people come up with is the rhinoceros, which indeed in Hebrew is called a karnaf, meaning a horn on its nose. But actually, it's not a horn at all. It's not attached to the skull. It's made differently than any other horn or antler, and it's really not a. It wouldn't be a shofar. Okay, so far so good. We've seen the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is usually the normative halacha. If you ask any Ashkenazi or Sephardi, this is how they would rule. They would rule that you should use a ram. And if you don't have it, and we'll see in a minute that some places didn't have, you could use these other horns. We saw that this is based on the three Mishnayos. The first Mishnah that says everything is good except for a bull. The next one that said you could use an ibex. And the next one that says you should use a ram. And the Shulchan Aruch clearly saw no machloket. He didn't see a difference of opinion, but he saw orders of preference. You prefer a ram. If you don't have, you could use ibex, or you could use anything else other than a bull. The Rambam did not see it that way at all. The Rambam said, no, there is a machlokas between these Mishnayos, and I'm going to paskin like one of them. And the Rambam says, mitzvahs aseh shel Torah lishmoa truas hashofar Rosh Hashanah, positive command on Rosh Hashanah, hear the blowing of the shofar. Shenemar yom shuai elechem. And now it tells you what it is. Shofar shetokim bo, the shofar that you blow, ben Rosh Hashanah, ben b'yovel, ukeren hakfasim hakafuf. The horn that you use on Rosh Hashanah must be a curved ram's horn. And if you didn't get the message, he continues. He says, "V'chol hashofarot psulim chutz mikeren hakeves." Every other type of shofar is not good for the mitzvah, except for a ram's horn. So the Rambam is emphatic. The Rambam says that those Mishnahs disagree with each other. The one that said everything is good except for a bull, we don't rule that way. The Mishnah that said that you should use a ram's horn, that's the one we rule like. And he probably said this based on the Gemara that says use a ram's horn to remember Akedat Yitzchak. But now we find we're in a big pickle, because unlike most Ashkenazim and Sfardim who rule like the Shulchan Aruch, the Yemenites of all people usually rule like the Rambam. And yet we said that if you go into a Judaic store, this huge kudu horn is what they're going to tell you is a Yemenite shofar. So how could the Yemenites have used a kudu horn if the Rambam says you must use a ram's horn? So the first thing to do is to clarify the facts. Did they actually use a kudu horn, or is it simply that the guy in the Judaic store wants to sell you this exotic and expensive horn, and he thinks that most American Jews coming in, well, Yemenite sounds exotic, this sounds exotic, we'll call this a Yemenite shofar. So the question is, before we try to explain how they could use it, we have to clarify, did they actually use kudu horns? And thankfully, we can actually find that out. But before we get to that, were there anybody else who used non-ram's horns? So, for example, I found Rabbi Herbert Dubrinsky wrote a PhD on Sfardim, and in there he says the Spanish Portuguese used the horn of an antelope. When I contacted him, he had no sources for me. Rabbi Nathan Cordoza lives in Yerushalayim. He says that the Spanish Portuguese shul in Amsterdam uses an antelope horn. Okay, when I contacted them, Rabbi Avram Levi, the rabbi of the Spanish Portuguese shul in London, said, no, we use a regular shofar. So let's keep looking. Is there anybody who uses a non-ram's horn? And I found an amazing, amazing story from the 15th century. There was a person there named Rav Lipman Mulhausen, Rav Yontif Lipman Mulhausen, better known for the work that he wrote about how to write Sefer Torah, about Stam, but he wrote a letter in 1421. And in this letter, which we're not going to read the whole thing, but the Hebrew is beautiful, he writes about, he lived in Germany, again, this is 1421, he's writing a letter, he lived in Germany, and all of the shofars in Germany in the 15th century, he says, were being made by a non-Jewish shofar maker. And this non-Jewish shofar maker had a monopoly, and he then passed on this monopoly to his son, who continued to make the shofars for the Jewish community of Germany. And he said that it turns out that what happened was people would bring him ram's horns, because all Jews knew ram's horns are shofars. And this non-Jew realized the Jews hadn't a clue about how to make a shofar. And they didn't realize that if you bring a ram's horn and it's all curved like this, it's really hard to make a shofar. But if you take a simple goat horn, it's no big deal. You just cut off the end and drill through. And this goy, 2 generations of non-Jews, were taking the Jewish ram's horns, keeping them, taking a goat horn and making a shofar from a goat horn and selling that to the Jews. And finally, some Rav Zamlin Cohen discovered this, and he went crazy, and he came to Rav Lippman Mulhausen, and he said, for 2 generations, the Jews of Germany have been using goat horns instead of ram horns. And he made a cherem, and he said, from now on, we're all going to learn how to make shofars. We're going to make the shofars from ram's horns. And he put a curse on any Jew who will use a shofar from a goat. So we see that there was indeed a community. 2 generations of Jews in Germany were using non-ram horn. But that was not because they had such a custom, but it was out of ignorance. They didn't know how to make shofars, and they were being tricked by the guy who was making the shofars. The question is, was there ever a place that actually had a custom to use non-ram horns? And thankfully, we have reports that can tell us about what places used. There was a person named of Yaakov Sapir, known by his book called the Evan Sapir, who lived in Yerushalayim, and in the mid-19th century was sent as a shadar, as a fundraiser for the Jewish community of Jerusalem. But instead of heading off to the wealthier Jewish communities of Germany and France, he went the other way, and he went to India and Egypt and Yemen and Australia and New Zealand. This is the mid-1800s. And I don't know how much money he came back with, but he came back with amazing stories. And he wrote a travelogue in which he records what the Jewish communities of India and Australia, etc., looked like in the mid-1800s. He wrote us. He wrote in his travelogue that Rosh Hashanah of 1859, he spent in the home of Mori Salam, one of the leaders of the Yemenite Jewish community. And he says, I had with me a shofar. He writes, it's amazing, in his travelogue. He writes about how he had everything. He wrote his own Megillah when he was in New Zealand. He took care of everything. And he brought with him a shofar. And he says, I blew my own shofar. Here in Yemen, he says, they blow a really big shofar of a Yael, he calls it. I guess he didn't know what it was. He calls it a Yael. He says it was 2 amot, 2 cubits long, and it was very curved. And that's what they use. They use the shofar of a Yael. Clearly, he was describing the kudu horn. So it turns out in mid-19th century Yemen, they were indeed using the kudu horn. And the question is how? How could it be they're using a kudu horn? So there are those who give different explanations. In this book by a Yemenite living today in Lakewood, he says, you know what? We always paskin like the Rambam. However, in this case, he says, we in Yemen had a custom that predated the Rambam. We used the kudu horn before the Rambam ruled. And therefore, even though the Rambam rules is not kosher, he says the Yemenite Jews continued to use the same thing that they were using all along. Rav Kapach describes it. Rav Kapach says, indeed, most parts of Yemen, especially the capital Sana'a, used ram's horns. But there were places, he says, where they didn't know how to make shofars from ram's horns. Or there were places they didn't have rams. And there, indeed, they used kudu horns. But he says they didn't even know what it was, because kudus come from the southern part of Africa. And just via trade, they came there. So he tells the story how in 1887, his grandfather, a rabbi in Yemen, sent one of these kudu horns back to Tiberias, to Tveria, for them to rule on if it's a kosher shofar or not. Anyway, I got to Tiberias. They looked at this thing, and they'd never seen anything like it in their life. They said, we haven't a clue what kind of animal it's from, but it's not from a ram. The Aruch HaShulchan finally says, you know what? He says, yeah, so someone has said before, you could toot your own horn with this. And it's really impressive. And you get up there on the bima on Rosh Hashanah and you try to blow this. Well, you want to blow one of these. And it looks really cool. But the Aruch HaShulchan says, how could it be? He says, yes, the Ravid and the Rosh and the Ran and the Tur, they all rule not like the Rambam. Meaning that b'diavad, it's not ideal, but you yotze the mitzvah with those other shofars. He said, but it's not just the Rambam. He says Rashi and Tosfos and the Smag and the Goyes Maimonides and the Arayim, all of them paskin like the Rambam, that a shofar is kosher only if it's from a ram and bet. He said, so it's obvious that on Rosh Hashanah, the one mitzvah that we have, what Jew wouldn't want to do it in the ideal manner? And he says, therefore, ideally, it should be done with a ram's horn. Now, what's interesting, though, is we often talk not only about ram's horn, but in our davening, we talk about a big shofar. We talk about Yitakah b'shofar gadol. In the time of the Mashiach, we're going to blow a big shofar. And the question is, what does it mean, a big shofar? So let's go back to Jewish artwork again. If you go back to the Jewish artwork, here is a Haggadah from 1560, and you can see the nice drawing on the bottom. And what is this supposed to represent? Well, clearly, riding on the donkey is the Messiah, and behind him is Eliyahu Hanavi, and Eliyahu Hanavi is blowing shofar. Now, this is the Shofar Gadol. This is what we've been talking about. This is the great shofar. And if you look how the artist envisioned it, he didn't envision a massive kudu or a huge oryx or even a really big ram. He envisioned a typical shofar that we're used to. Because clearly when we pray daily for shofar gadol, we don't mean a physically large shofar. We mean a shofar whose message is a large message. It's an important message. Shofar gadol means a shofar that's going to give us the important message. Indeed, throughout history, the Jews have seemingly been using not physically big shofars, but ideally ram's horns, unless it wasn't available. Now, if we just think back for a minute, those of you who remember those mosaics from the synagogues from 1500 years ago, and I noted that those shofars didn't quite look like the shofars that we're used to. I don't know how to explain it, but very disturbingly, many of those shofars remind me much more of a bull's horn than of a ram's horn. I don't know what they were using. I don't know if those were really ram's horns, if they were poor artists. But when I pointed out that they don't look exactly like our shofars, they look more like bull's horns. Okay, so anybody has any questions, any comments?
Hello, I'm from England, and Rabbi Cardoza taught me at SEM. Rabbi Cardoza is very precise, and I suspect he was in Amsterdam or wherever in the 50s and 60s. No, listen. Listen.
Okay.
So I think Holland may have changed since then. Most Jews are leaving. Coming to England with Sephardi shul with Rabbi Abraham Levy, who unfortunately died recently. I don't want to be rude, but you have to understand that the British love their animals, and it may be that the antelope, which for some reason is regarded as more important than a sheep in England generally, I don't think you can just say that maybe it wasn't used by the Sephardim. There may be a different custom in the UK. That's all I'm saying. My own rabbi says you can use either a ram, he's Haredi, ram's horn or whatever. And I'm not in London, I'm in Manchester, and I'm not Sephardi. But Rabbi Cardoza is extremely precise. I learned a lot from him, and Holland has changed beyond recognition since the 60s, unfortunately. So they may be doing things differently. But thank you very much. I think the M was a unicorn at one point. I was trying to look it up in the mob.
Correct. No, 100%. There are those who say, because unicorn was a myth that existed in many places. And there are those who have tried to explain what a unicorn, what did the observer see that he thought was a unicorn? And many people say it was the oryx, because it has these very, very straight horns. When you look at it from the side, it looks like there's just one horn there. So thank you for that comment. I wasn't questioning Rabbi Cardoza. I was just bringing anecdotal evidence.
It's a marvelous book. I have to write an article about shofar. You've helped me, and I'm going to say your name. I've learned such a lot. But when it comes to England, it's a strange country to do with animals, and they always, try and conform. It's not like America, where people, in my view, don't conform as much. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Thank you much. Like I said, I was looking for examples of places where they use something other than the ram's horn. The story from Germany, 1450s, is well documented, and it was many of the people. The Evan Sapir documents it in Yemen, and it seems to be that there are other evidence as well. The evidence from the Spanish Portuguese, like I said, I was not able to find it documented in any of their sources. I had just various hearsay. Okay, any other comments?
Yes, I own this shofar. Do you see it?
And not well.
Now better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And it's straight in this direction, complete straight. And do you know the origin of that? Somebody told me that this is from Morocco.
Yes, so I wanted to say, if we go back to the pictures, let me share screen again. If we go to the very beginning here, when do you see the screen, my screen now?
No,
Do you see the PowerPoint? No, hold on. Let's try that
no,
again.
I don't.
Wait, well, hold on. Let's try that again. Okay, do you see the PowerPoint?
Now I see Shofar. ממה יכול להיות עשוי?
Yeah. So let's go back now to those pictures from the we're all at the end. From the Jewish Encyclopedia. If you look at the hold on. Okay, so these pictures, so again, most of them, it doesn't tell us where they're from, but 11 and 3 and 8, where you see it's totally straight. They made dimensional. That was typical of Germany and Morocco. I don't know why those two places specifically, but that's very traditional. And indeed, in Morocco, they made shofar cases that you would put the shofar in. It was flat. And if you're making a shofar case in Ashkenaz, where not Germany, but the rest of Eastern Europe, if you have a shofar like this or like this, everyone's going to be slightly shaped slightly differently. In Morocco, they were all shaped the same. They're all shaped like you were showing, like in number 8, number 3. They would make cases where you would carry the shofar in them.
Number 11 shows the same type of artwork that you can see in this one. You can see really the number 11.
They did. There was a lot of
artwork that you have.
They would engrave it. They would do. There was all kinds of artwork that was put onto those shofars. And again, Germany and Morocco.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And it sounds. It sound is amazing. If you can get it, it's really beautiful.
Okay.
You didn't talk about the mouthpiece, and the Mishnah talks about it being covered in gold, right?
Yes.
You didn't talk about that or the shape of the mouthpiece, or if there are any restrictions, number one. And number two, there's that picture that you showed, I think from Amsterdam, where the Baal Tokeh is standing on the bima. Is he blowing it from the front of his mouth or the side of his mouth?
Okay, it's very hard to tell. This does look like the front. It's interesting. I'll start with number 2, pointing out that according to the Shulchan Aruch, ideally one should blow from the right side of the mouth. This looks like he's blowing from the middle. I don't know. I haven't looked into it. It could be he had trouble. I don't blow for the shul on Rosh Hashanah, but when I blow, for example, during Elul, I only succeed in getting a sound out from my left side of my mouth. I can't do it on the right side. But you're right. It does look like it's from the middle. Your other question about plating it with gold. So the Mishnah talks about that. The Gemara discusses it, and it says that there should not be anything on the mouthpiece itself. You would put it on the rest of the shofar. And really, in terms of shaping it, it's interesting you mentioned. I didn't discuss the mouthpiece at all, how to shape it. I skipped over these pictures of this. Where is he? This guy. Where did he go? I had some pictures of a guy making shofars. That's what he does. People who have trouble, there are only really 2 factories in Israel. There's one in Haifa with a branch in Tel Aviv, and there's another factory in the Golan Heights which gives tours. He probably makes more money off of his tours than off the shofars. I don't know where those pictures were. There's a guy in Beitar Illit who is really very handy, and if you show up there with your shofar and you have trouble blowing it, he's able to adjust the mouthpiece so that it's easier to blow. And it's fascinating going there. Okay, I don't know where those pictures were, but that's what he does. So the mouthpiece, really, there's no rules about it. You could do anything you want with this, as long as you make it so it's easier to blow. And you can't cover it, correct, with gold. You shouldn't anything on top of it. Okay, where is this guy? Oh, well. Here he goes, this fellow. This is what he does. He shapes the mouthpieces. He has all these different drills and instruments to shape the mouth.
Okay, anybody else?
A little pointer for all the people who blow shofar. I'm blowing shofar from both sides, and this year I took a little drill, attached it to a handle, and I was able to clean, because what's happening with the shofar through the years is it's a bone, like Ari explained, it grows inside. So what you do, if you have any issues, take it with a really smooth way of the drill, put it inside to the right size, and it will definitely help you to get a better sound. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. If there are no other questions, so everybody should have a wonderful Shoshana. And those who blow the shofar, b'hatzlacha, may all the sounds come out perfectly, and everybody else should enjoy the listening to the shofar.
If I may, Ari, thank you. Talking about, being the sounds. I don't. My uncle years and years ago, I remember my uncles told me there was a very man who had blown shofar every year, and he was 85, 90, and he really didn't blow so well. It wasn't so good, so people wanted to replace him. So I think somebody said, "Uba shofar gadol yitaka." When a great person blows the shofar, called Mamad Akayishma, even if they only hear a little bit of the sound, it's okay. I thought that was a cute thing.
Very nice. Right, someone just wrote, is a kosher shofar from bone or not? No, let me just make sure everybody got that clear before we go away. This is how a horn, not an antler, a horn grows. You have the bony insert. The bony insert is removed, and the shofar is then the part that's around it, where the bone was in here. Now you have a shofar. If it's from an antler, you cannot, it's not a shofar. It's not even a shofar, it's puzzle. So from a bone, it's not kosher. Actually, well, technically, since this is a kosher shofar, you actually are allowed to drill straight through the bone if you want. But that'll be much harder. It's easier to just take it out.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
How many shofars you have at home?
We have a few of these for educational purposes.
Gotcha. I gotcha. Okay. Really want to thank you. It's always a pleasure, always interesting and sort of off the beaten track, that term. And that's, I think, his specialty. That's one of his specialties. So really, Ktiva v'chatima tova, Ari, and please God, we look forward to learning with you in the future. And thank you, Judy, again. And 1:00 in 57 minutes, Simi Peters will be continuing with her series on Sefer Yonah. That's 57 minutes, same channel. And tomorrow, Sarah Gordon will be giving the Parsha Shir at night, my Shir Friday morning on the Machzor, and we switch from the Siddur to the Machzor. Saturday night, Rabbi Liebtag, 10 p.m. Ari, you getting up at 5 in the morning to your Rabbi Liebtag at 5 a.m.? He's dedicated to 5 a.m. in the morning, Israel time, 10 p.m. for us people on this side of the Atlantic.
But Jay, you know that everything you know is I taught him. We were chavrusas for 2 years.
You and Menachem?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Cool. When?
And that's before he knew Tanakh. We learned all of Yoma together.
Really? Okay, very nice. I did not know that. Very, very nice. Okay, great. There you go. So Ari said you should come on Saturday night. Okay. And, morning, of course, 9:15 to 1:30. I just put it in the chat box. Please register. It should be, I hope, a fantastic program. 8 speakers, half an hour each, back to back to back to back, however backs we need, and some coffee in the middle. And so that'll be Sunday, 9:15 to 1:30. And as I've mentioned, you have to register. There's separately. If you register for the LU, you will not get the login. There's a thing being done as a separate program. So please do. It takes a half a minute to register. And if you want to make a donation, so it takes 45 seconds. So that's appreciated very, very much. Okay, Shana Tova. Okay, I think that's it. 55 minutes till Simi Peters on Sefer Yonah. Okay. By the way, the Shemesh is very strong in Toronto today. It's even though it's September the 6th, 35 degrees, and it's humidex of 43, something like that. So I'm happy to be inside in the air conditioning room as opposed to the Beit Shemesh that with outside. Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Hey, Ari.
Okay, bye-bye.
Hi,
Rabbi Berkheimer. How are you? Good.
West Hempstead days. Remember West Hempstead? 55 years ago.
Wow.
I was the director. Wishing you a Shana Tova.
Thank you.
Same to you, Rabbi Kelman.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi Berkheimer. Be well. Okay, we should all be well. And okay, we'll see you all, hopefully, please God, pretty soon. Okay, for good learning. Okay, have a great day. Bye-bye.